by salesperson on that spreadsheet. So what I'm going to do is I have 4 boxes that I have the ability to throw these columns into. I can left click, hold, and drag these boxes, these columns into one of these boxes here. And depending on what box I throw it in, it's going to do something different to the data. Now, let's go ahead and run through this. Let's say I want to go ahead and build a filter. So I can filter for the regions and see a region breakdown. I can get this region column and put it in the filters box. And notice how an area up here got built, and I can filter my pivot table once I build it based off a certain region. Now that we have that down, you should go ahead and throw in the region, left click, hold, and drag, and throw it in the region box. You could have used the check mark, but what it's going to do is it's going to predict where you want it to go. And as you can see, it predicted wrong. You can left click from here and move it up, but I just like having a left click and dragging it into the field I want it to go in. Now, we can go ahead and get the salesperson, and we can move them over into rows here. And what that does is it builds me a pivot table with the rows of each salesperson. Check it out. I have 3 salespeople in that data set. And I want to point out the fact that try getting your salesperson and filtering by them now. Okay, it took it outside the rows. It didn't let you do that. Let's go ahead and put back salesperson into rows. And the reason why they don't let you throw in an existing row into the filters box is because if it's a row, you already have the filter. The filter is right here. If you want to filter for that row, you can have the sort and you have the filter for it. So it doesn't let you throw it in the filter box if it's already in the row box because of that icon right there. Now that we have that down, we want to see a breakdown of the sales they bring, and we have a values box. The values box is going to run a function on the data set we give it. So the sales is numerical. I'm just going to drag it into values. And right over here, it found the sum of the sales. If I wanted to filter by over here, I can go ahead and filter by the regions. Now everything's looking good. We can still make our pivot table even better. Let's go ahead and sort this pivot table. So I'm going to click on this data set here. And I know earlier in the day we discussed a sort option over here to sort. But let's sort the pivot table itself and not the column. So I'm going to go ahead and right click the pivot table and sort from largest to smallest. Great. So I went ahead and sorted my pivot table. Watson's my best seller here. And another thing we can do to the pivot table is we can apply some number formattings by right clicking it, choosing number format, and applying that currency format there and choosing OK. Alrighty. Now we have a pretty basic pivot table. It's showing us just the salespeople and the sales they bring with the grand total down below. Let's go ahead and go to our Analyze tab of our pivot table. So click on the pivot table and go to Analyze. And one thing I want to expose you to is this filter over here. It's useful, but it's the old way of filtering. It'd be nice to go into the Analyze tab. Just click on it. And insert a slicer for the region instead. The thing we covered for tables in the previous videos, I'm going to go ahead and insert a slicer. And I'm going to build a slicer for the region. And I'm going to hit OK. And just like that, I have now a visual way to filter for my regions. And I can see what region's doing. I can see how each salesperson is doing for the regions, like so. Go ahead and build this pivot table, add in another slicer for the salesperson, play around with it, sort and add the currency format. And if you're feeling courageous, maybe see a pivot table that shows you the revenue or the sales by region instead. Alrighty, part 2 of the video, we went ahead and discussed adding in a slicer, as well as sorting the pivot table and adding in the currency values from the right-click way, as well as the fact that your rows have a filter here and it can't be thrown inside the filter box there. So let's go ahead and extend further on a pivot table because it can do a lot. So what if we wanted to see what these salespersons were selling, what types of products they were selling? You're allowed to get a pivot table and get 2 columns and throw it into rows. So I just got salesperson, and now I threw the type of what they're selling. So Bishop selling frozen yogurt, ice cream, popsicle, and tasty treats. Now I can get this aspect of it, and I can go ahead and sort it from largest to smallest. Alrighty. I can see that ice cream is Bishop's top selling, and he's my top seller. And it so happens that Watson's second is ice cream. Top selling product is ice cream, and he's my second top seller. I can maybe tell my other sellers to start selling more ice cream. So we can find out a lot of information on a pivot table, and you can put more than one thing into the rows here, like I just did. Now that we have that down, we've exposed ourselves to the Analyze tab of the pivot table quite some time now. Let's go ahead and hover over to the Design tab of the pivot table, to where I want to just let you know you have several different report layouts, several different ways you can view this report. More importantly, just 3. We are currently looking at it in compact form. How I describe this is we have 2 rows, but 1 column in our pivot table, hence compact. I'm going to go ahead and change that to outline form, and this shows you each row as a separate column, like so. Some people really don't like these blank cells here. They don't know if this is Watson or is this Bishop. For those people, they can go to Report Layout, and they can repeat the item labels so they can see each item, like so. Makes it easier to analyze. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the Report Layout item labels by going to Do Not Repeat. And the last layout is tabular, which makes it look like a spreadsheet, puts boxes around everything. You still have the pivot table functions, makes it look nice like a spreadsheet. And of course, you have the ability to remove subtotals. These are subtotals, and as well as grand totals. You can even show them above or below, bottom of the group, top of the group. So you can also go ahead and turn off the grand total, like so. Or you can go ahead and turn on the grand total, like so. Various settings that you can modify in the Design tab of the pivot table. Go ahead and expose yourself to the Design tab, play around with it, maybe change the color scheme of it, see the different report layouts, and then come right back when we discuss some more features of a pivot table. Starting to notice that a pivot table is a huge function in Microsoft Excel. Now, sometimes when you're building a pivot table, you're going to have to see the same pivot table every month on different data. Or you're going to add more data to it, or maybe you're going to change the data and you want to see the pivot table, but you already have it built. Now, you don't have to sit there and build another pivot table just because you updated the data. Let's go ahead and just try this out. Let's go to the pivot table sheet here. This is the sheet that we built the data for this pivot table. This is known as the source data sheet, source data. In the source data sheet on the very first sale, let's go ahead and make that into something really large. Let's just do 1 million. Alrighty. So he had a big old sale for his first sale. Right over there, made $1 million. Now, in the North region, let's all go back to our pivot table. And let's notice, well, let's first clear the filter here. And let's notice how we don't see $1 million anywhere for Bishop. It was Bishop that had the sales. That's because you have to refresh the pivot table. You have to let Excel know that you want to update this pivot table on the newly added or the newly modified data. Several ways to refresh. Let's go ahead and run through those. Everything's always a right click away. So if you right click from your pivot table, you will see the option to refresh. If you're in your pivot table and you go to your Analyze tab, you're going to also see the option to refresh. If you hover over it, you're going to see that Alt F5 is the keyboard shortcut to refresh. And if all else fails and you're forgetting all these ways, just know that in your Data tab, you have an option to refresh as well. Now that we expose ourselves to the various places that we can refresh, I'm just going to right click and choose to refresh this pivot table. And just like that, you saw the updated change. So now that we have a refresh and we saw what it did, let's go back to the source data. Let's go back to the pivot table sheet. And this time, let's go all the way to the bottom. Now, I'm just going to duplicate this row, and you should too. So select the row by clicking on the number, going to your Home tab, and just copy that row. and then going down to the next row here and hitting enter. Now for this one, I'm just going to go ahead and add in a new salesperson. We'll just say my name. We'll put Faz. It'll be the North region. Except my sales, we're going to make it something large again. We'll put it 1 million. Alrighty, I don't think that's 1 million. Nope, that's 10 million. I'm doing even better. So I just added in a new salesperson and added in a whole new row. Let's go back to our pivot table and refresh it. So we just go to the pivot table, right click, and refresh. And we don't see a fast salesperson. That's interesting. Let's go ahead and dig down on this and see what's going on. Let's go analyze this by going to our Analyze tab. So next to the refresh, which is one way of updating your pivot table, there's Change Data Source. So I'm going to go ahead and select that to show you that the source of the pivot table, the source that it refreshes from, stops at 168 because that's what we built the pivot table off of. So that newly added row, I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom here, is not included into the refresh every time we hit refresh. All we need to do is adjust that. To change that to a 9, I could have dragged it across, and then I hit OK. And then it automatically put in the refresh. It put me on top. The list is sorted. So it automatically sorted me up to the top, added in my salesperson, and put in my total right down below. Go ahead and play around with that and check to see if you can go ahead and add in another value to the bottom of the list and update the source data and refresh it to reflect that change. Pivot tables are a great way to summarize large data sets. Now, some people are just visual people and they're going to request a chart. You are allowed to make a pivot chart, and if you have a pivot table, you're in luck because you can build the chart based off a pivot table. Now let's go ahead and make a very simple pivot table again. Let's just remove the type breakdown from this sheet, so just drag it out and throw it out. Just have a very basic pivot table to start out with. And if you want to build a pivot chart off this pivot table, we have shortcuts to generate charts. All you need to do is hit the Alt key and you hit F1 and you generated a pivot chart for yourself, just like so. And we go ahead and select the pivot chart. You have 3 tabs that come with it: Analyze, Design, and Format. And it's basically the visual version of your pivot table. Notice how we have an axis now, it's salesperson. You have the filters, it's region. And you have the sum of sales right over here. And it just shows your pivot table visually. The same charting rules apply. You have the plus and the paintbrush. Can't filter it because it's a pivot table. You can filter it through the pivot table. But pivot charts are very simple to build based off a pivot table that's already existent. If you know the shortcuts, all you need to do is hit Alt F1 to generate it on the same sheet. If you still happen to want it on a separate sheet, you're just going to go ahead and hit the F11 key, and this will generate the pivot chart on a separate sheet, to the left-hand side of the pivot table sheet. So go ahead and expose yourself to a pivot table and the pivot chart version of it. Realize that if you move something outside of the pivot table, it's going to move it outside the chart. They're all connected. If you filter something from the pivot table, it's going to filter something for the chart. It's pretty cool, right? We are currently on the data validation sheet of the sample file provided for the class. If you yet to grab that, go ahead and grab it and go to data validation and come right back. Alrighty. So sometimes you build a spreadsheet, you want to send it out to your colleagues or maybe a client, except that this spreadsheet goes into a database, or for some reason you need to have everything spelled correctly, like the sales rep names that they're going to fill out. They need to have the date in a certain format that they need to put in, and they need to have a certain range of dates that they want to put in. Or maybe the credit limit can only be a certain value, otherwise it won't be accepted. Now you can set these certain rules to apply on certain cells to validate the data that goes within them. It's known as data validation. Let's go ahead and run through the various ways that you can validate data on a spreadsheet. So the first one is, let's say you have some sales reps and you have a list of sales reps here, and everyone keeps misspelling it. Maybe one person is putting Jack T, the next one's going to go ahead and put Jack T, and your database, that's supposed to be a J, and your database keeps having a hard time finding Jack because there's so many different versions of them. and it's hard to summarize and analyze data that way. Hence comes in data validation. Let's all go ahead and highlight the data set that we want to validate. Let's all go ahead and highlight the cells that we'd like to validate. So these are the cells. I only want these values to go within it. I need to tell Excel to do that, so I highlight the cells. Then I go to my data tab here. And over here, I have an option for data validation in my data tab. It's in the data tools. I'm going to go ahead and give that a click. And for data validation here, you have some settings, an input message, and an error alert. These two are optional, meaning if you don't fill them in, they have default ones that will be filled in for you. Let's go ahead and run through this. So I want to build a list of values. I want to have a list of people they can fill in. So I'm going to pick a list, and I want to find out what values I want to use for that list. That's called the source. So these are the values I want to use for the list that I want to build for data validation. So I'm just going to put my cursor in here. I can collapse this window by hitting that little arrow to see more of my spreadsheet. Drag down on the range of cells that I want to use as a list. Hover up and collapse or expand the window this time. And I filled in the settings. Let's all go to input message. I'm going to go ahead and put title. This is input message. Just very generic so we can see how it's going to look. And I'm going to do an error alert, style stop. You can do warning, information. I'm just going to do stop. I'm going to do error alert. And I'm going to put error message just so we can see how that's going to look. And once we fill in these three settings, well, settings, input message, and error alert, we can hit OK. Now, every time you go ahead and hover over one of these cells, you're going to get the input message. You go away from it, it goes away. The input message, can it be moved? Looks like it can be. Just left click, hold it, and drag it, and it moves it away. Notice how an arrow appeared on this cell, but it didn't appear on this cell because these are the ones with data validation. If you try typing into the cell, like hello, and you hit enter, you will get the error message, like so. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel here. And each one of these cells now have a drop-down list where a user can go ahead and select. And if they don't have these matching criterias of the drop-down list, it will no longer let them put it into that cell. So for yourself, go ahead and expose yourself to the various other data validation rules that you have. And just realize that instead of doing a list of data, you can have a range of numbers by just highlighting the data set and going to the data tab and choosing data validation from here. And this time maybe choosing decimal numbers and doing a min and a max. So it's either going to be 0 or 1. Between 0 or 1, nothing else. And remember earlier I said these are optional, and you can just hit OK. So if you put in 10 here, it doesn't match. But if you put in 1, it accepts. Go ahead and practice doing a data validation for a range of dates by highlighting the date column, running up to your data tab, and exposing yourself to data validation using dates. All right, we are currently on the conditional format sheet in the sample file provided. Go ahead and go to that sheet and come right back if you're not there yet. Now, you'll be analyzing data, and sometimes it'll be helpful to point out certain traits of the data to conditionally format certain pieces. Like, for example, highlight all of the towns called Fayetteville. Or maybe highlight all of the square feet that are above 2,000 in green because I'm okay with those. And then over here, maybe show me all the bedrooms above 3 because if it's above 3, I'm okay, but below 3, I'm not. What you're asking to do is apply conditional formats. Let's go ahead and run through various conditional formats. So notice how in your Home tab, you have a bunch of styles. One of the styling methods is conditionally formatting something. Let's go select column B, and you want to see all of the houses that are above 100,000. And you want it to just be highlighted nice and green because you're going to be okay with that. Just all go to select column B and go to the Home tab and go to conditional formatting. And if you want, we have several ways to do conditional formatting. We can highlight cell rules. We can do something greater than a certain value, less than a certain value. Between a range of values will trigger the conditional format. Equal to something, text that contains, all these various options. We're going to do greater than. Alrighty. Now, I'm just going to do greater than 100,000. And for me, if it's greater than 100,000, I'm going to go and make it a green fill with dark green text and hit OK. Let's try another example of a conditional format. Let's all click on column C here. And this time I want to highlight a certain town. You can go ahead and pick your own. I'm just going to pick the first one. I want to highlight every town with that name. And I want to make it red. So I'm just going to go to select column C, hover up to home, go to conditional format. And this time I'm going to do highlight cell rules here. And I'm going to do greater than, less than, between, equal to. Seems right. I'm going to say what I want it to be equal to trigger that conditional format. Just like that. I'm going to make it red and hit OK. Now, for square feet here, I'm going to select column D and go to conditional format. And for square feet, I want to expose you to color scales. You can go ahead and maybe make like a rubric from green to red to see how close it is or how far it is compared to the average of the numbers. So it's between a set of ranges. So the greenest is the smallest and the red is the largest in square feet. Pretty nifty. Go ahead and play around with the other conditional formats in these two columns. And when you come back, we can go ahead and show you some other conditional formats that allow you to build a formula within the conditional format. All right.